And this week, of course, we start with the big news from the weekend, which is that dreadful and awful Sri Lankan church bombings story. Easter Sunday it was. Islamists conducted 8 bombings of Sri Lankan churches and hotels, 7 of which were suicide attacks. 3 of those were at 8:45 a.m. There was another at 8:50, another at 9:05, 2 more in the afternoon. And so far there are 321 reported dead, over 500 injured, and the toll is expected to rise. The victims came from 8 countries. They included worshippers at St Benedict's Catholic Church, St Anthony's Shrine and Protestant Zion Church, and others included staff and patrons at the Shangri-La Hotel, the Kingsbury, the Cinnamon Grand and a small guest house. Also, tragically, 3 police officers lost their lives in the investigation that afternoon when they were searching a home where they were looking for suspects, and a bomb went off. 3 officers were killed. Now, no group has taken responsibility for the attacks just yet, but the government has said that they were organised by 2 Islamist groups known as the NTL and the JMI, both domestic groups within Sri Lanka. The junior defence minister has also said that these were retaliation attacks in the wake of the Christchurch mosque shootings last month. And that's very worrying, because this whole concern about retaliation attacks going back and forth is becoming very real. But also interesting that its churches bear most of the brunt. Most of the people who died were actually from the churches, over 100 in a single church. But churches are targeted for what essentially was done by a guy who had no connections whatsoever with Christianity. But unfortunately, that's the polarised worldview that you have in many parts of the world, that the West, that the white is Christian. And so this concern about retaliation attacks is very real. Sri Lankan police have arrested 40 people in connection with the attacks. And there are details to this story that, if it were possible, actually make it worse, because it turns out that the government was tipped off by an unnamed foreign intelligence agency that the attacks were imminent. And they haven't said who it was, but the FBI have actually been working with them since Sunday on the case, and so it could well have been someone as reputable as the FBI. The warnings were detailed. They named the NTJ. They said churches were at risk, and yet the country's security agencies didn't heed the warning, and that's been called a colossal failure on the part of the intelligence services. They knew back as far as January that NTJ Islamists were stockpiling detonators and weapons, and yet nothing was done. It raises questions about why, how, what's going on there. What was the reason for that? Who dropped the ball? Was it deliberate? And all that kind of thing. You know, the whole business is desperately tragic. Many will have seen images of the dozens of Sunday school children that were caught up in the blasts, many of whom perished. The loss of over 100 people from a single church, the loss of police officers in the execution of their duties, the evil that made this even happen, the kind of world that we have to contend with, where we see this sort of thing on every hand. The fact that there were Easter celebrations which were overshadowed by this, an event of such joy and such pain and sorrow. And we are left to really ask what it is that we can do. And the thing is, in the wake of such desperate tragedies, there are things we can do. For one thing, we can pray, because God is real and He does act, and He does respond to prayer. We can pray for the victims, we can pray for their families, and we can pray for their communities. And we know that God, in His way, will bring about His purposes in this situation. We can actually pray that God's purposes will be done despite the tragedy, because He's sovereign. And He is so sovereign that you think of, for example, what Joseph said to his brothers many years after they betrayed him and he went through all that he went through. He says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And He is so sovereign, in fact, that He can work through evil. He can work through bad circumstances. Not that He made it happen, but that He can use circumstances, no matter how desperate, no matter how far gone, to actually achieve things in His plan, and perhaps things that are really great. And so we trust the sovereignty of God in these things. We trust God's greatest purpose, that's faith. But also we trust that this purpose will come to pass for all of those who have been involved. But there's something else that we can pray for. And this is a uniquely Christian thing. This is a Christian distinctive, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. And it is that we can pray for our persecutors. We can pray for our enemies. He says, Jesus says, love your enemies. In other words, do good to your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That is His instruction. And we might turn around and say, well, How can we do that in any way other than a way that is grudging, other than a way that is that we wish we weren't, or a way that we don't really mean it? We're just going through the motions. How can we pray for persecutors, even on this scale, and mean it? And you know, Christians uniquely can do that. And they can uniquely do that because the true Christian who understands what God has done for them is able to say what the Apostle Paul said. He said, "In my flesh dwells no good thing." In other words, he's saying, look, I, in my natural-born self, have nothing good to offer. You know, it was Christians throughout the ages who have been saying, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. In other words, I could be as bad as a person can be, but for the fact that God's grace has been shown to me. But for the fact that God has changed me, but for the fact that God has blessed me. This notion that all that is good in me comes from outside of me. It's God's blessing. That is the nature of sin. That is the nature of a sinful person. That's the nature of fallen creatures, is that they do as bad, they can be as bad as they can be, but for God's gracious intervention. You know, you think about this, it starts even with the whole idea of salvation itself. You think of what the Apostle John says, where he says, you know, it wasn't actually that we loved God. It didn't come from our side, but it was that he loved us and sent his Son. It was a God thing. Or you think of what the Apostle Paul says. It's not that we actually were able to grasp towards some kind of the life of Christ in ourselves. It's not as if, you know, we ourselves worked up to that life. No, he says we're dead in trespasses and in sins. We walked according to the course of this world, you know, and we were lost in that. But God, he says, it's all of him who was rich in mercy. And because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses and sins. And he goes on to say, by grace you have been saved through faith, not of works, in case anyone should boast. And he goes on and says in Corinthians, he says, where is boasting? It is excluded. Why? Well, mercy, right? God who is rich in mercy. As one theologian says, you know, as soon as you think you deserved mercy, you're not thinking of mercy anymore. Because mercy by definition must be totally undeserved. It comes entirely from God, not in response to any good thing in us, but purely because he is good. And you know, when we understand that, it changes our attitude to people. It changes our attitude to those who are not me or even us. It's actually a lesson that Isaiah learned, and one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible has got to be Isaiah 6. And he learned this lesson in a most powerful way, and it's a lesson that's learned by most people who encounter God in the Bible. You remember he saw that great vision where the angels were saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And Isaiah, of course, has this traumatic experience where he cries out, woe is me. And that means he consigns himself to hell. That's what that means in prophet speak. Because he says, he suddenly realizes that I'm undone. He's deconstructed. He's brought down to nothing. He realizes that he hasn't got one atom of self-worth to hold up his credit in this situation. He goes on to say, I'm a sinner. He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. This is a sinful world. He sees it all in a way that he hasn't seen before. And from that position where he is brought low, you see the grace of God starts to come. The angel comes forward and with that symbolism of the burning coal says, your sin is atoned for and forgiven. Why? Well, the image of sacrifice, because of what Jesus was going to do in the future. And then God says, you know, after he's restored in that way from outside of himself, God says, who shall go? Who will go? Who will go for us? Who shall I send? That's it. He asks that question. And Isaiah says something very significant. He doesn't actually say, as you would think is sort of the natural corollary of that request, he doesn't say, I will go. I'll go. Doesn't say that. He actually says something much more profound. He says, here I am, send me. As if he has this deep conviction that, no, he can't go in his own strength. Whatever good he's going to achieve for this God who he's just seen, whatever ministry he's going to do through the grace of Jesus Christ is going to have to be through strength outside of himself. He's going to have to achieve good, not from he who says, woe is me, I'm undone, I'm a man of unclean lips. Not him, but God. It's strength from outside. He will have to be sent and thrust forward into what he does. And you know, that lesson is throughout the Bible. Whatever good is in me, I thank God. Whatever has been done in my life is from outside of myself. To God be the glory in all things. I take no credit. I do not boast, because it is by grace from start to finish. And that is why Christians throughout the ages have said, as I said before, there but for the grace of God go I. It's a very different attitude to other people. They believe fully that but for God's grace, they could be anything and anyone, even the worst persecutor of the church, as the Apostle Paul was. Remember, he says, sinners of whom I am chief. That's what I was. But who stopped Paul? It was the appearance of Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. And so when we realize that, and when we look into this world in which persecution is very real, in which it is situation normal for Christians, we can actually do something remarkable. We can pray for persecutors. We can pray for those who hate Jesus Christ. Because do you know what? Jesus actually said on the night in which he was betrayed, he said, you know, the world hated me, so it will hate you. You know, you're my witnesses to the end of the earth, so it's going to happen. It's the same kind of world. He says, you know, they persecuted me, so they'll persecute you. But he says at the end, why? He says, because they do not know him who sent me. And I think that should be the thrust of our prayer. As was seen for the worst persecutor in the days of the early church, where Christ revealed himself to him and he came to know God himself, we should pray for the same for those who persecute us. And I do wonder whether this is increasingly relevant in a world where violence appears to be increasing and where challenges in our own country, as I'll talk about in a minute, seem to be getting substantially worse. It's all about getting the right perspective and calibrating our vision well. Hey, that's the extent of my sporting ability.